My own son and his wife were secretly drugging my nightly tea, trying to make everyone believe I was losing my mind. Their goal was to have me declared legally incompetent at a hearing they arranged all to get their hands on my inheritance. They saw me as nothing more than a confused, frail old woman who was in their way. But they didn't know my new nurse was my secret ally, and the competency hearing they so carefully planned was actually a trap. The police were already on their way. It started with a fog. Not the charming kind that rolls over the Connecticut hills, but a thick, soupy fog inside my own head. I'd be in the middle of a sentence and lose my way, the words just dissolving on my tongue. It began a few weeks after my fall, and my son Robert and his wife Susan were suddenly ever present, their faces etched with a deep theatrical concern. Robert's concern, though, felt different. Beneath the dutiful son routine, I could see a frantic, panicked energy in his eyes, the look of a man clinging to a ledge by his fingertips. Their visits quickly became a full-scale occupation of my life. My kitchen, once my domain, was now theirs. They insisted on preparing all my meals, citing my health and frailty. Susan, in particular, took charge of my nightly ritual, a cup of chamomile tea, to, as she put it, help me rest. Every night she would bring it to me in my favorite porcelain cup, her smile a little too bright, her insistence a little too firm. The fog seemed to thicken after that tea. They'd point out my confusion with such pity in their voices, reminding me of conversations we never had and appointments I'd supposedly forgotten. They spoke of my decline as a sad, inevitable fact, and in my drugged haze, I almost started to believe them. But there's a part of you, a core of who you've always been, that refuses to be extinguished. One evening, as Susan handed me the steaming cup, a flicker of my old self, the sharp, intuitive woman my late husband William always admired, broke through the haze. Her hand lingered on mine a second too long, her grip too tight. It was a gesture of control, not care. I took the cup, and with a steady hand I hadn't felt in weeks, I brought it to my lips and pretended to drink. When she left the room, I walked over to the large potted fern by the window and poured the bitter liquid into the soil. I rinsed the cup and went to bed, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something I hadn't felt in a long time, clarity. The difference was staggering. There was no fog. My mind felt sharp, my thoughts crisp and clear for the first time in months. The horrifying truth settled over me, not with a crash, but with a cold, quiet certainty. My son and his wife were drugging me. They were systematically poisoning me to create the illusion of incompetence. The grief of that betrayal was a physical pain so sharp it almost took my breath away. Later that night, fully awake and alert, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. I held my breath, listening. It was Robert's voice, a desperate, strangled whisper I barely recognized. He was on the phone, his words tumbling out in a torrent of panic. I crept to my door and pressed my ear against the cool wood. I only caught fragments, but they were enough. He was talking about a margin call he couldn't meet about losing everything. And then came the two words that explained the entire monstrous charade. He spoke of an imminent foreclosure notice. My son wasn't just greedy, he was desperate. And his desperation had turned him into a monster. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. The morning after my horrifying discovery was unnervingly beautiful. Sunlight streamed through the windows of my bedroom, and for the first time in months, the world didn't feel like it was wrapped in gauze. My mind was my own again, sharp, clear, and filled with a cold, terrifying resolve. I was a frail old woman in a house controlled by my enemies, but now I had my greatest asset back my clarity. That morning was also the first day for the new home nurse Robert had hired. Her name was Carla, a woman in her 40s with calm, observant eyes that seemed to miss nothing. I saw her as a potential witness, a lifeline. I just needed to find a way to show her the truth without saying a word. My opportunity arrived with the morning tea. Susan brought it in on a tray, her smile as brittle as a dried leaf. She set it on my bedside table, telling me it would help with my fogginess. I waited for Carla to enter the room to check my blood pressure, and then I made my move. With a shaky hand that required very little acting, I reached for the cup and let it slip, sending the tea and the porcelain crashing to the hardwood floor. As Carla knelt to help, I subtly pointed toward the mess. In the puddle of tea, a strange, chalky white residue was plainly visible, a milky sludge that was definitely not chamomile. Susan's reaction was all the confirmation I needed. She rushed into the room, her face a mask of barely concealed panic. She didn't worry about me or the hot tea on the floor. Her eyes were locked on the shattered cup and the white residue. She shooed us both away, overly anxious, insisting that she would clean it up herself. She frantically gathered the broken pieces into a dustpan, her movements jerky and panicked. Her extreme overreaction was a confession, and I saw in Carla's watchful eyes that she had read it loud and clear. Later, after Susan had gone, and Carla was helping me get settled in my armchair, I seized the moment. When the house was quiet, I looked directly at her and asked a simple question. I asked her as a nurse if she had recognized the residue in the cup. Carla met my gaze, and in her eyes I saw not pity, but a flicker of professional anger. She told me that in her years as an ER nurse, she'd seen a lot of things. She said the residue looked exactly like a crushed sedative, a common anti-anxiety pill that would absolutely cause the kind of confusion and memory loss I'd been suffering from. A wave of relief washed over me, so powerful, it almost made me weep. I wasn't alone anymore. In that quiet, shared moment, a silent, powerful alliance was formed. We didn't have much time. My small act of defiance must have spooked them. That evening, Robert and Susan came to me with grave expressions. They informed me that they had been speaking with my doctor and had scheduled a preliminary cognitive assessment for the following week. They said it was to get a baseline for my decline. I knew exactly what it was, the first step in the legal process to have me declared incompetent. The timeline had been set. The stakes were no longer just my health, but my freedom. With an ally in the house, the game changed. Carla was my anchor to reality, my co-conspirator in a war no one else knew was being fought. Each night, she would bring me a fresh cup of real chamomile tea from a thermos she kept in her bag, and we would perform a delicate swap. I would take the drugged cup from Susan, thank her, with a convincing tremor in my voice, and later, Carla would discreetly dispose of it. My mind remained clear, but my performance of a frail, declining woman became my full-time job. I would drift off mid-sentence, ask the same question 3 times in an hour, and stare blankly at the television. The relief on Robert and Susan's faces was sickening. They believed their monstrous plan was working perfectly, that the upcoming cognitive assessment would be a simple formality to rubber stamp my incompetence. Their confidence made them careless. One afternoon, while I was supposedly taking one of my long, sedated naps, I overheard them in the hallway. They thought I was asleep, but I was wide awake, listening to every hushed, desperate word. It wasn't a plot they were discussing, but a confession. I heard the shame and terror in my son's voice as he admitted the full, humiliating truth to Susan. He had fallen for an investment scam, a fraudulent fund that had promised impossible returns. He hadn't just lost their savings, he had secretly taken out a second mortgage on their home, and now it was all gone. A final foreclosure notice was coming. His plan to take my fortune wasn't born of simple greed. It was a frantic, pathetic attempt to cover up his own catastrophic failure and save himself from public ruin. Knowing their desperate motive only strengthened my resolve. My quiet afternoons with Carla became our war room. While I appeared to be dozing in my armchair, she would be on her tablet researching the sedative she suspected they were using, documenting its known side effects on memory and cognition. Our counteroffensive needed more than just suspicion. It needed irrefutable proof. The following day, a small, discreet package arrived for Carla. Inside was a simple digital clock, the kind you'd see on any bedside table. But this one had a tiny, nearly invisible lens hidden in its face. That afternoon, we replaced the old clock in the living room. The stage was set. That evening, their arrogance delivered them right into my trap. They believed I was completely incapacitated, snoring softly on the sofa after my nightly tea. They sat opposite me, their voices low at first, then growing louder as their confidence grew. Right in front of the silent, watching eye of the clock, they laid out their entire conspiracy. I heard them discuss the sedative's dosage, making sure it was enough to keep me confused, but not enough to raise a doctor's suspicion. I heard them talk about their lawyer's strategy for the competency hearing and their confidence that with my recent decline, they would be granted guardianship of me and my entire estate within a month. I kept my breathing even, my eyes closed, and let the camera record every single damning word. With the secret recording of their confession secured, the next phase of our plan was to gather the final corroborating pieces. Carla, with her years of nursing experience, knew exactly how to create an official paper trail. The next morning, she approached Robert and Susan with a clipboard and a professional, slightly apologetic air. She informed them that her nursing agency required a complete and official list of all my medications for their records, a standard liability procedure. I watched from my armchair as they exchanged a look of smug confidence. Of course they were happy to comply. They quickly typed up a list of my heart pressure pills and vitamins, printed it, and handed it over with a flourish. The sedative, the very drug they were discussing in the video, was conspicuously absent. Carla thanked them, made a dated note on her official report that the list was provided by my son, and filed it away. They had just officially documented their own lie. The final piece of the puzzle, the motive, was still just a snippet of a panicked phone call I'd overheard. I needed something concrete. Our chance came that afternoon when Robert and Susan left for what they said was a meeting with their lawyer to finalize the plan for my care. The moment their car pulled out of the driveway, Carla helped me to Robert's old bedroom where he had been stashing my mail. It was all there, hidden in a desk drawer, a pile of letters they had deemed me too confused to see. It didn't take long to find what we were looking for. There it was, a thick envelope from their bank with the words, "Final Notice of Foreclosure," visible through the window. Beneath it were glossy brochures and now worthless statements from a fraudulent investment fund promising impossible wealth. Holding those papers in my hand, I felt a profound and unexpected shift inside me. The pure, hot anger I had felt at their betrayal was suddenly cooled by a wave of deep, sorrowful pity. This wasn't the work of a criminal mastermind. This was the pathetic, desperate act of a weak man drowning in shame. My son, the boy I had raised to be strong and honorable, had been so terrified of appearing as a failure in our wealthy, status-obsessed community that he had chosen to become a monster instead. The betrayal was no less monstrous, but seeing the pathetic truth of his failure made my resolve for justice even firmer. This was no longer just about revenge. It was about a painful, necessary correction. I sat at my desk, the evidence laid out before me like a battle plan. Carla's report documenting the lie about the medication, the foreclosure notice proving their motive, and the tablet ready to play the video of their own voices condemning them. All the pieces were there. I looked at Carla, my quiet, steadfast ally, and I knew it was time. I told her to make 2 calls. The first was to my own estate lawyer, Mr. Davies, a man who had worked with my late husband for 30 years. I instructed her to tell him everything and to be at my house next Tuesday morning. Her second call was to my son. She was to inform him and Susan that I had agreed to their little cognitive assessment and that I would be ready for their doctor next week. I was no longer a victim being dragged to a hearing. I was a judge willingly walking into the courtroom I now controlled. The morning of the hearing, I allowed Susan to give me my tea. It was part of the performance. I played the part of a frail, confused woman leaning heavily on Carla's arm as I was guided into my own living room, which had been rearranged to look like a makeshift courtroom. Robert and Susan sat on one side, their faces a perfect blend of sorrow and resolve. Next to them sat their lawyer, a man with a smug, predatory smile, and a specialist doctor they had hired who looked professional and neutral. On my side, there was Carla, my steadfast ally, and my own lawyer, Mr. Davies, a kind, white-haired man who had been my late husband's closest friend. He looked at me with a sad, knowing glance. We were ready. Robert and Susan's lawyer began. He painted a masterful picture of a loving son forced to make a terrible decision. He presented a timeline of my rapid cognitive decline, since my fall, citing my forgetfulness, my confusion, my erratic behavior. He presented notes and reports, a tapestry woven from lies and half-truths. Then the doctor they had hired turned to me. His voice was gentle, patronizing. He asked me simple questions. He asked me what the date was, who the current president was, to count backward from 100 by sevens. I fumbled the answers, my voice weak and trembling. I let my eyes drift unfocused around the room. I could see the look of triumph growing on my son's face. He believed he had won. When the doctor paused to make a note, I gave Mr. Davies the signal we had agreed upon, a slow, deliberate blink. My lawyer, who had been sitting in quiet dignity, stood up. His voice, though calm, cut through the room with absolute authority. He announced that he must interrupt the proceedings as he had reason to believe his client was the victim of a serious crime and that this entire hearing was a fraudulent attempt to cover it up. A shocked silence fell over the room. Robert's lawyer began to object, but Mr. Davies held up a hand and simply continued. He stated that we had evidence of felony elder abuse and a conspiracy to commit fraud. On cue, Carla stood and presented a small sealed evidence bag containing the chalky residue from the teacup she had saved. She gave her professional opinion as a former ER nurse on what it was. Then Mr. Davies produced a large tablet and placed it on the coffee table for all to see. He pressed play. The silent room was suddenly filled with the sound of my son's and his wife's voices, crystal clear, recorded by the digital clock on the mantelpiece. Everyone watched frozen as the video showed them openly discussing the sedative's dosage, their lawyer's plan for this very hearing, and their confidence that they would soon be granted guardianship over my entire estate. The judgment was immediate and absolute. The doctor was the first to speak, his face pale with horror. He looked from the tablet to Robert and Susan and announced that he was witnessing a crime, and as a medical professional, he was obligated to report it immediately. Before he could even reach for his phone, Mr. Davies spoke again, his voice grave. He calmly informed the room that it wouldn't be necessary. He had already contacted the police that morning, and they were on their way. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. The next few moments were a blur of surreal, quiet chaos. 2 uniformed officers entered my living room. Robert and Susan just sat there, their faces slack with disbelief as they were read their rights handcuffed and led out of the home they had tried to steal. Their grand legal trap had spectacularly backfired, and they were arrested in front of the very authorities they themselves had convened. After the police led them away, a profound and heavy silence settled over my living room. The ugly machinery of their plot had been dismantled, leaving only the quiet hum of justice in its wake. Mr. Davies handled the legal whirlwind that followed, but the social fallout was a storm of its own making. In a community like ours, built on pristine reputations and old money, a scandal like this wasn't just news. It was a contagion. The story of the dutiful son who drugged his own mother for her inheritance spread in hushed, horrified whispers through every country club, charity luncheon, and dinner party in Fairfield County. My son and his wife had been terrified of financial ruin, but what they achieved was something far worse in their world: total and irreversible social annihilation. The legal consequences were as swift and severe as they deserved. Faced with the irrefutable video evidence and Carla's meticulous documentation, they had no defense. They were convicted of felony elder abuse and conspiracy to commit fraud, and both were sentenced to prison. Their partnership, a union forged in greed and status, anxiety crumbled under the weight of their shared disgrace. I heard through Mr. Davies that their marriage dissolved into a mess of bitter, resentful recriminations before they were even sentenced. They had tried to destroy me to save their family, and in the end, they were left with nothing and no one. With the fog in my head permanently lifted and the poison of their presence gone from my home, I began to truly heal. My physical strength returned, and with it a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Carla, my steadfast ally, stayed on her role, shifting from caregiver to a trusted friend and household manager. Together, we worked with Mr. Davies to reshape my future and redefine my legacy. The first order of business was to revise my will. The fortune my husband William and I had built together was never meant to be a tool for greed. It was meant to be a force for good. So we established the William Sterling Foundation, a charitable trust in my late husband's name. Its mission was simple and clear: to provide legal aid and support to victims of elder abuse and financial fraud. The very weapons that had been used against me, the law, the manipulation of trust, would now be used to protect others. My family's greed would not be the final chapter of my story. It would be the seed from which something truly good would grow. Months later, I was sitting in my sunlit garden, the air filled with the scent of roses. The world was quiet, peaceful. I was on the phone, but not with a family member consumed by shame or greed. I was speaking with a woman from Ohio, a widow whose children were trying to do to her what mine had done to me. She was the first person my new foundation was helping. Her voice was filled with fear and uncertainty, and I listened patiently. When she was done, I didn't offer her pity. I offered her strength. I told her that her mind was her fortress, and that the truth was her sharpest sword. I told her she was not alone. As I spoke, I realized I wasn't just advising her. I was articulating the final, powerful truth of my own journey. I had transformed my personal trauma into a public legacy of protection, ensuring that the ugliest chapter of my life would have the most beautiful ending. They say living well is the best revenge, and for a woman like Margaret, that was certainly true. Her real victory wasn't just about watching the police arrive, but about the quiet reclamation of her own mind. True justice, she proved, is about reclaiming the very thing they tried to take from you: your dignity, your peace, and your control. The mental clarity they tried to extinguish with poison was the very light that exposed their darkness. But sometimes, showing them exactly who they messed with is a very close second.